It is 72 BC, and Spartacus has managed to defeat several consular legions sent from Rome against the rebellion. From the Battle of Mount Vesuvius to the Battle of Picenum, the slave force has grown from just 70 members to nearly 90,000. In the capital, citizens are terrified after learning of the huge mob marching in their direction. In Rome, panic spreads, and they prepare for the defense of what appears to be an imminent battle. Although Plutarch claimed that Spartacus only planned to escape to northern Italy and then disband his forces, the rebels have decided to turn back and move decisively against the capital. Let's not forget that these slaves had a great resentment against the Roman population, as they had been mistreated in all sorts of unimaginable ways. However, Spartacus decided to divert his forces and not attack the city. The reason for this maneuver is attributed to the fact that they did not have the equipment to besiege the great city, and also because it would undoubtedly attract the troops of Pompey Magnus, who had been in Hispania fighting a rebellion for several years. Clearly, Spartacus understood that it was one thing to defeat the consular legions he had faced so far, and quite another to fight against elite soldiers, legions composed of veterans with years of combat experience. Regardless of its motives, the rebels marched south, heading for the city of Thurii, where they would spend the winter. It is said that, among other things, they exchanged with merchants the riches obtained for iron and copper, which was then smelted to make weapons and military equipment with which they could defend themselves. Obviously, as the troops advanced, they left a path of destruction in their wake, plundering all the settlements they found and taking whatever food reserves they encountered along the way. It should also be noted that after so many battles, they were no longer mere rebel slaves, but were now effectively a military force with a certain discipline and numerical strength. Since Spartacus himself had served as an auxiliary soldier in Macedonia, his men now had basic training in the Roman combat tactics typical of the time. As for the overall force, some historians say that in reality the slaves did not form a single group, but that there were various factions commanded by other gladiators, and that not all of them followed Spartacus. Among the names mentioned are Gannicus and Castus, and also Crixus and Enomeo, who had died in previous years. Meanwhile, in Rome, a new commander was appointed, Marcus Crassus, who was named praetor and was put in charge of 6 new legions, in addition to the legions of Gellius and Lentulus that were defeated the previous year. In all, his force was estimated at about 40,000 men. But valuable time had been lost forming the new legions, and at this point, after spending the winter in Thurii, the year 71 had begun, and the slaves were again marching north, this time advancing towards Capua, possibly with plans to attack the capital. Crassus' troops moved south, and he chose to divide his forces, placing 2 legions under the command of his legate, Mummius. Crassus ordered that they were not to engage in combat in any way. What they were to do was simply to stay close to the slaves in order to gain time and information about where they were. It is not known exactly where or how the battle took place, but it is certain that as Spartacus advanced, everything was going according to plan. But in an unexpected moment, as soon as the opportunity presented itself, Mummius disobeyed the initial orders he had received and attacked the rebels. This initial engagement was undoubtedly somewhat successful because of the surprise effect, but unfortunately for the Romans, it did little, and the rebels quickly managed to inflict casualties on the enemy and put the 2 Roman legions into a disorganized retreat. The plan had ended in complete failure for Rome again. But the fighting was not over yet. There was still the main force of Crassus, with about 30,000 soldiers. However, the prognosis was not good, having lost 25% of his initial force, and with a history of desertion and fear of Spartacus, the praetor needed to come out with something as soon as possible. And so he said that any man fleeing the battlefield would be killed for cowardice. He ordered his forces forward to make the initial attack despite the recent defeat, and the 2 armies clashed shortly after the fight against Mummius. The 2 groups held their ground, fighting with all their might. However, Spartacus and his men failed to penetrate the Roman lines, and in fact, many slaves were falling dead before the Roman swords. Casualties were mounting on the insurgent side, with the dead numbering in the thousands. The ground became more and more stained with the blood of the rebels, who were holding on as best they could. The discipline of the legions and the determination of their commander not to take a single step backwards was paying off. The hours passed and the corpses were trampled by the Romans as they pushed against the front lines. And when the casualties reached 6,000, realizing the disaster that was coming if they continued to fight, Spartacus gave the order to fall back. After a bloody battle, the rebels retreated south to regroup and try to decide what to do. And meanwhile, in the Roman ranks, Crassus took one of the most drastic measures yet. Since Mummius and his men had disobeyed the initial order not to attack Spartacus until after the battle had begun, Crassus chose to impose an old military law on his subordinates, the decimatio, the Latin word for decimation. Literally, it meant to kill every 10th man of the group who disobeyed the main orders. But it was not just a matter of executing them. The death was to be by beating and perpetrated by their own comrades. According to Appian, a total of 4,000 Roman soldiers were executed in this way, and the psychological effect on those who were forced to apply the punishment was enormous. Such was the result that the soldiers were now more afraid of their own commander than of the enemy, since any act of indiscipline or cowardice would be terribly punished. After disciplining his men, Crassus ordered a rapid march on Spartacus's troops to give them no respite, and there were several minor battles which took place over the following weeks. Unfortunately for the rebels, the results were always the same. Crassus charged hard against the slaves and managed to kill thousands of them, putting the rest of the group in retreat. Without a doubt, everything seemed to indicate that the war had taken a new turn, this time in favor of the Romans, who until now, in the last 2 years, had been defeated in almost all the encounters that had taken place throughout Italy. But it was still too early to claim victory, and despite the recent defeats, Spartacus undoubtedly still commanded a large force which posed great threats, especially if he were soon to win a victory in battle. Seeing that confronting Crassus directly was not working, he opted to retreat through Lucania to Messina, and from there head by ship to Sicily and incite a new slave revolt on the island. The idea was a good one, since it was there that the first 2 servile wars had occurred decades before. Knowing the history of the place, and that if taken, the island could serve as a heaven for runaway slaves, and as a fortress to defend against the Roman forces, Spartacus made an agreement with a group of Cilician pirates to take him and 2,000 of his men along the Strait of Messina. The aim was to get reinforcements in time to save the rest of his followers, who were now on the defensive. Having paid off the pirates, the rebels continued to retreat back towards the Rhegium area, heading for the strait. Crassus, for his part, wanted to wipe out the entire slave force as soon as possible, and so he ordered the construction of a defensive fortification to keep the rebels trapped near the strait and thus starve them to death. Many rebels began to cut down trees and to build rafts and small boats in order to cross to Sicily with Spartacus and the pirates as soon as they arrived. But we will see that in the next chapter of the Third Servile War. And while we wait for Spartacus's transport fleet to arrive and start a new uprising against Roman Sicily, why don't you leave us a like and share the video with your friends? We also invite you to subscribe and activate the notification bell so you don't miss the battles as soon as they start. We give special thanks to all those who have been accompanying us as we follow Spartacus on his march to immortality. We also want to welcome those who joined our channel just recently. It is your presence that motivates us to keep going and maintain this channel alive. We hope to see you in the next episode, and if you have any questions or suggestions, don't forget to leave them in the comments. Thank you very much for being with us, and see you soon.